we are almost at the end of our day with our second discussions of today. Here are our speakers, and I hope it will be a matter of an interesting discussion. There will be questions from you coming from the participants. Now we will discuss the issue of power and how power, the games of power, can affect certain individuals, but not only the individuals, populations as well. Our speakers for today are Her Excellency Ambassador Mr. Madam Papadescu, diplomat and specialist in this area. We also have Her Excellency the Ambassador of South Africa, Ethel Matinso, and later we will be accompanied by His Excellency Sergiu Cialac, former ambassador and also specialist in this area. Now our discussion will follow a certain kind of pattern. We would like our speakers to present their ideas, and then if possible, then we encourage you to address questions. The first one to speak will be Her Excellency the Ambassador of South Africa, Ethel Matinso. So please, Her.
Thank you very much, moderator. Good afternoon. I must say, I've just been saying to both Excellency and our moderator that I have to have something that we call in South Africa truth and reconciliation from the onset. After our liberation, we didn't take our former oppressors to Nuremberg. Instead, we called them to a huge hall and said, speak the truth so that we can reconcile with you. Now, the truth here is the fact that, one, we're not going to quite get a speech. And I'm not quite an academic, nor am I a political expert in these matters. I'm here only because I am quite interested in what the young people of today think about the whole world and what their plans are for the whole world, because we elderly are trying to leave you a better world, but you yourselves are the leaders of the future. But you can't quite build the world in the future, so you've got to start building it now. So my interest here, and I must confess it's right from the beginning, I was telling them that I'm very interested in many things, but at the top of those are the youth, and the second one are the women and gender equality. Firstly, let me thank you for having invited me to make this presentation, an academic and an analyst as it is going to be. I must also start by highlighting to you that the recent events in my country, which come under the terminology of xenophobia, are quite glaring examples of the impacts of power on humanity. They are a reflection of exactly what we're going to be talking about. And I should take this opportunity in this forum to pass our condolences for the death of, by today, at least 8 people because of that. And our view as South Africans is that no matter how big the contestation of power is, and no matter how big, huge the problems, it does not warrant any taking of anybody's lives. And in our situation as South Africans, we would say that it is against our fundamental principles. We've got one of the fundamental principles is called Ubuntu, which is in Romanian, I think, Uman, which is the respect of humanity, the respect of the dignity of the other. And Mandela takes this further in his description, and he calls Umtu Ngumtu Ngabantu. You are because I am, and I am because you are. And it's something that is what our value system is based on. So for us, this is not like us as South Africans. And our government has already taken measures. We've got an interministerial committee that is taking these matters By this morning, it was getting so bad that we've actually had to invite the Defense Force to really protect. Now, I will ask to speak on the impact of power struggles on the human dimension, and I've already apologized because I don't have any academic definition of what is power, what is struggle, what is dimension, what is human, and what are the relationships between all this. And because some of you are the political students of political studies and all these things, they come in volumes, these definitions. But I will move from one simple premise or definition that power struggle is a situation where two or more organizations or individuals compete or even fight for influence or control of a situation or a behavior of a people. Of course, the extreme sides of these is unpleasant or violent competition for that power. Now, power struggles can move from private to public. Economic power, political power, personal power, cultural power, ideological, and there's been a lot of these ideological, cultural, religious, social identity. And these range from one extreme to the other. And so do the struggles. They can start, and sometimes at home, as a gender feminist, between my late husband and I could see that there were lots of power struggles between the two of us, just starting in the kitchen right to the bedroom and back to the kitchen and back to the lounge, but there were always these kinds of, and of course they didn't fortunately result in violence, but there was some sort of power struggle. So you have these power struggles subtle on the one extreme, but in the other extreme, extremely violent. And in South Africa we've experienced many of these. And one of the key elements sometimes is who owns what. And sometimes the person who owns determines the answer to the question of who wields power. And who wields power over society and over the world. And we from Africa have experienced many countries wielding power over us, generally, especially if you take from the times of colonialism. But we as African societies and within our societies, within our own countries rather, we've experienced power from different kinds of levels, including the power, as I was talking about, within the family, and the power of chiefs over us, and the power of men as women over us. We've always had, as South Africa, some men that are wielding power over us. So over the 20 years, we've just emerged from one form of power struggle, and that was the greatest for South Africans, apartheid. Now, some define this as a power struggle between the architects of apartheid, or the colonialists, and the indigenous people. We, the indigenous people of South Africa, don't define it as power struggle. We define it as anti-colonial struggle and also struggle for freedom. Now, the issue, is there a difference between a power, what you can just generally call power struggle, and anti-colonial or anti-dictator or anti-gender oppression or anti-anything, anti-racism kind of struggle? Is there a difference? Are they all equally power struggles? Is there legitimate power struggle or a just power struggle? Or are all power struggles illegitimate and unjust and violent and all these things? Now, it's a debate that you probably have as to whether you can have what is called a legitimate power struggle or not. I don't know, I don't have the answer, but I know that in our context in South Africa, as Africans, we've always waged what we called a legitimate power struggle for people's power. We called it people's power because at that time, the people, the indigenous people of South Africa, did not have the power, and therefore were engaged for that kind of power, for freedom. Africa itself emerged from colonialism almost about 52 years ago. According to the UNDP, between the 1980s and the 1990s, is estimated about 35 African countries, and this was post-colonial, except for Africa and Sahrawi, if you recognize it. There were armed conflicts, which were an indication of power struggles again. and over 550 million people were directly or indirectly affected by those kinds of. So you first had the colonial, and then you had the post-colonial kinds of struggles. Some of us then define even these post-colonial kinds of struggles that their origin or one of the key factors is actually colonialism. How then they present themselves after colonialism will be whether it's ethnic cleansing, whether it's political power because people want to be in authority, whether, which is one of the vicious struggles in Africa, the economic power struggle, because very few, if any, African countries have got the economic power, so we're still engaged in that struggle. So this is a very complex and intricate question of these power struggles. And I've already referred to the fact that we can trace some of these to the colonization of Africa and the scramble amongst the imperial powers of that time for a piece of Africa, for their own benefits. It was not so much for the benefit of Africa, it was for their own benefit. And that kind of colonialism still continues to date under one guise or another. And one of the key ones is the neo-colonial power, with some of the former colonialists still wanting to own in one way or another a piece of Africa. And of course, when we talk about a piece of Africa, we've got a very large, a huge piece as Africa, because contrary to belief, the continent is one of the richest continents, and we're the biggest continent. And of course, needless to say, we're the most beautiful continent. You all have to agree. So there's and the resources of this world, whether you're talking about gold from South Africa, you're talking about oil from Northern Africa, or you're talking about rich natural resources of the continent. And the struggle that was then in the colonial era continue now, in one way, as I've said, another. Now, that is one time of the colonial struggles. But it's not as if the Africans were passive recipients of colonialism. There was a resistance against colonialism. So you've got the anti-colonial struggles, which themselves were quite costly because they ranged again from peaceful means to armed means. South Africa is one example. We started in 1912 with peaceful means of anti-colonialism, or in 1652, when the colonizer arrives, we resist. And we've got anti-colonial wars that cost more than 30,000 people that are waged in South Africa. But by 1912, when we were organized as one formation in our organization, the anti-colonial struggles coming in the form of anti-apartheid struggles, they are costly not only to South Africa, but the colonizer, the apartheid architects, they go and attack people as far away as London. They attack, of course, the neighboring states that are hosting the so-called refugees. I was one of the refugees, so I'm a product of some of these things, so I can talk about them. Now, if you also look at Africa, I've already talked about our riches and our wealth. But there's this continuous effort to get to that wealth. And as a result, one of the things that you can look at in terms of the power struggles, the outcome is the fact that Africa is not developed. Africa is not integrated, because even the borders in Africa are not the borders that were determined by our forebears. They are artificial borders that have been given by the colonialists. And what is the result of that? The fact that even today, Africans are fighting amongst themselves about issues of the borders, because these were not the borders. Somewhere in Namibia, between Namibia and Botswana, there's a lake. Now this lake, this island rather, not a lake, is on a lake. Because it's on a lake, nobody could define exactly which side belongs to Botswana and which side belongs to Namibia. And this island, in some seasons it comes up, and then the fight about this island is very vicious when they can see it. And then sometimes it sinks, and when they don't see it, they don't fight that much. So these are the borders because they argue that these were the borders. But there were no serious borders between the current Namibia and Botswana, but they fight over that. We've got a lot of mining companies. We'll just give an example. For instance, De Beers is the biggest. And they trade in Angola and Sierra Leone and Congo. And De Beers is a foreign company. But the wars that have emanated from this company, about this company, around this company, on the question of the minerals. And these, again, is question of these the power struggles that we're talking about. Shell in Nigeria is also not a Nigerian company, Shell. But there was a crisis because of, again, the issues of resources. And we know that the Ken Saro-Wiwa was killed because of this. This, again, the impact. Now, I just want to share with you some of the statistics. Post-colonial era, there are different kinds of struggles in Africa, and mainly about political power, who wages power. These take different forms, whether it's ethnic cleansing, or there is religious cleansing, any kind. But you can again trace this to the question of resources. Who is going to own what? And the Western world, especially the previous colonizers, have got a hand in it because they've got an interest on who is in power. Because whoever is in power, they have to decide how easy would it be to access our resources as Africans. So you look at this, sometimes they are presented as religious, but if the political students here look at what are the fundamentals for these political struggles, it probably, some of them have got a hand. But the genocide in Rwanda is mainly around ethnic cleansing. There's the Hutus and the Tutsis. But even as the Hutus and the Tutsis are having this, it's about, of the two, who should wield economic power. Political power is an access to the economic power, so they are about that. And it is said that in 100 days, from April 6th to the July 16th, 800,000 to 1 million people were killed. You can watch something that is called The Hotel. There's a film that was based on this. During that period, 6 men or women or children were murdered every minute in that period. So there were these murders. Now, more than 250,000, between 250,000 to 500,000 during that 100 days, children, women were raped. More than that, they were raped. But they produced children of rape. Now, if you are looking at a stark reality, you then have in Rwanda today more than 500,000 children who are products of rape, whose mothers were raped because of this genocide, of that period rather, of the genocide. More than 67% of those women who were raped in 1994 alone, they were infected with HIV and AIDS. More than 67% of the more than 500,000 women. So you are talking about more than 250, more than 300,000 women today, or at that time, had rape. And they therefore also produced children who have got HIV and AIDS. So by 2013, it was said that 21,000 were vulnerable survivors because the problems have not yet been solved coming from that period. And 75,000 of the orphans that are in Rwanda are orphans of that genocide of 1994. So in 2015, we are still experiencing the impact of that genocide. And half of those children have not been able to go to school. And we can take it further. What is it going to mean for so many children who have not yet gone to school? And by 2007, 40,000 survivors in Rwanda did not have any shelter. I'm not talking about education, they just did not have any shelter. If we look at in Sudan in 2003, again, you are talking about millions of the rape, especially of women. If we look recently, recent history, in Libya, more than 30,000 were killed during that struggle. Now, I've just given you figures. In South Africa, I've already said more than 30,000. But between 1912, when the African National Congress is formed, and 1994, when we get our liberation, more than 13,000 people have been killed. And there have been more than 30 that died in detention. There are those that have gone into exile, never to return. Some of them returned. I'm one of the refugees. I returned after 15 years from exile. And it was thanks to the anti-apartheid struggle, we can call it the power. Now, today we are faced with Yemen, we are faced with Syria, we are faced with many of this. Now, as I've already said, the impact of these kinds of power struggles, in whatever form they come, but once they become violent, especially where you've got conflict, the impact of those, the first ones to suffer are the women, the children, and the elderly. They are displaced from their own places, and women are raped. And I want to read you an example from the problems that we had in the early 2001 in Burkina Faso. A woman says, I left my house in the evening to buy food for my children. A soldier attacked me and pushed me off the road. He threw me into the bushes. My baby, who was 1 month old and 1 week old, 1 month and 1 week old, was on my back. He threw the baby off my back and put a gun to my chest. When I reached to save my baby, he took my clothes off and raped me. I told my husband what happened. He left me. I was treated in a clinic, and it turns out that I got sexually transmitted disease. And now my husband has left me. Now, so systematic sexual violations against civilian populations are one of the impacts that we can talk about of these kinds of power struggles, especially where there is a war. And communities are stigmatized because you get the stigmatization that you belong to this tribe or that tribe, or you are a woman, or so on and so forth. And often the victims of sexual violence are stigmatized, not only stigmatized, but are chased away from their own families, especially by husbands, but also the communities. There's still a lot of stigma that goes with rape, where in many instances the woman herself is blamed for the rape. And then you suffer from being raped, and then you suffer from the stigma, and you suffer from the rejection. Now, you get raped. It's very rare that you are raped once. In many of the countries, including South Africa, you get raped, you go to the police. The police start, mostly men, they ridicule you, they do all kinds of things. The society, the family, just about everybody. So you are the one who literally has raped yourself, and then you get raped once over, twice over, and 3 times over, even your children in some instances. And this what happens a lot during conflict. Now, millions have been displaced, I've already said. Now, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Sierra Leone says that they did an interview. More than 733 people were selected women, and 143 of these were girls aged between 6 and 17. 73% of these claimed that they had actually been either sexually violated or they suffered one human rights abuse or another. 52% said they'd been sexually abused, 47% that they had been raped, and 26% they had been gang raped. This is a picture that I just wanted to throw on the just one instance of this of conflict. Of course, I think that as young people and as the world, we should pay a lot of attention to these power struggles and the impact. But we should also pay attention as to what can be done. Because raising the questions and debating them is not enough. This is why many of the countries in Africa have signed many of the conventions. But one of the weaknesses that we're finding, especially when you talk about the elimination of discrimination and the child abuse, is many countries sign this, but there is no implementation. They are there on paper, and you can check them. And it is also what has emerged in some of the African countries, is then that you have, in conflict situations, you have peacemakers, the UN personnel, all kinds of people coming to assist in kinds of programs. And we have statistics from West and Central Africa. There's evidence that the saviors that are supposed to assist, they've also sexually abused the women and children. A study was done in Liberia, and children, at least 1 out of 3 children, reported that they'd been exchanged. The children are taken to a camp, and the people that have come to save them are there working in that camp, and they take them and sell them for sexual favors to the very people that were actually involved in the conflict. And the other worrisome thing is question of the integration, because the integration doesn't take into consideration the questions and the difficulties that are faced by girl children and young women. Now, I think, as I've said, that we're going to be looking at some of the solutions. I've not done any exhaustive discussion. I think that some of the questions are going to arise. Africa has established what we call the African Union, which is a continuation of the Organization of the African Union. In 2013, we were celebrating the OAU formation, which was formed as an anti-colonial tool for Africa to unite against colonialism. But in 1993, this was then changed, in 2003 rather, this was changed to African Union. And the idea being that Africa should unite for its economic, political, social, and cultural development. But above all, it should also unite so that we can say we are masters and mistresses of our own destinations as Africans. What usually is presented in the media of an African, especially an African woman, find an African woman that were presented as nothing other than a human skeleton carrying a lot of things on the head, carrying a baby on the back, having other children, most of them having snots. For some children, all these African children tend to have snots, all of them, and with a lot of flies on them. And that's not Africa. It's somebody defining us as such. We don't say we don't have problems, and I've talked about this. But as Africans, we've come together and say our identity, our culture, everything about us is something to be proud of, besides fighting for economic, political, and culture. Of course, most of the cultures in the world, especially music and sculpture, come from Africa. But nobody wants to recognize this as something that is European. We think that we ought, as human beings, find solutions. And one of the things we need to do, that discriminatory attitudes and values do not belong to human beings. Because we are human beings, irrespective of our religion, our color, our sex, our anything. First and foremost, any one of us, if you cut us, we have blood, and we are human beings, we are not animals. And therefore, the people that have been able to discriminate against anyone is because of the kind of power to act in a particular way that they have. And this is the power that must be removed, because some have got power because they are white. I am about to retire. I want to write a book about being African woman in Europe and traveling around Europe. It's one of the worst sins that apparently my parents committed, because just about everywhere you go, immediately you get anywhere, there's a suspicion. You can't just be going around and doing your own business innocently. There must be something. Either you are traveling because you're going to be a sex slave in some country or whatever, but there's something. So that question of respect of the human dignity of a person, I think that is one of the things. so that people don't have the power to act. And others have the power to act because of their wealth. And if you see sometimes what is happening in the international fora, WTO, when they negotiate about some of the things, it's not considering Africa and the developing countries. It's considering their interests. Because the other beings are not human. What we're going to be doing is to export our raw materials or whatever is being negotiated. Now, racism, sexism, and all kinds of viewing the other as a threat are those fundamental things that can assist in resolution or in making a point that we don't have these kinds of power struggles. Now, as South Africa, we are collectively trying to find solutions to our problems. One of the challenges that we're having, as I was talking earlier on, is the question of immigrants from the rest of Africa running away from some of their political and economic problems in their own countries and coming to South Africa to seek a better life. You will know that just in the week since April 17, there are more than 800 Africans who perished in the Mediterranean Ocean trying to get into Italy because they are getting away from economic struggles, power struggles in their own countries, political struggles, all kinds of things, poverty. And they're coming to Europe. And of course, some of the European countries, the attitude that they themselves have because of the scarce resources probably, which is what is also happening in South Africa. Some of the South Africans thinking that you are coming to take our own resources. Now we've got what we call the Agenda 2063 as the African Union. And this Agenda 2063 tries to look at what it is that we can do as Africa to avoid Africans traveling all over to seek better lives when they can actually find better life in their own continent. They should be doing that. We ought to, as a world, discuss the historical and cultural circumstances that have tended to empower and reinforce certain dominant groups. And this, as I've already said, the wealth, the economic, in the world, who owns what wealth? And in the world, we used to talk about sort of the two worlds. But in the world now, this so-called unipolar world, who owns? And what kind of power? Those that think that they own the wealth in the world. What kind of power do they have over the rest of us? I attended a conference where one of these powers was talking about the development of Europe. Not the development of Europe, but the geopolitics of the world, to be correct. And towards the end of the discussion, which was about 2 hours long, I thought that in the world there is no Africa. Because we did not feature anywhere. We don't have power, we don't have wealth, and yet the same country was taking so much from our continent. I'm going to ask this in advance, because I would like to be invited to one of the forums where we are going to be discussing gender equality and sexism in the world. Because one of the areas of power struggles are on gender. And sometimes these are so overlooked as power struggles, it becomes, as other people would say in my country, the issue of Beijing. Now they are not wanting to say women's emancipation and gender equality. They just want to put it as an issue. Oh, that issue of Beijing will address the issue of Beijing. Now, the issue of Beijing or gender oppression is something that unless we get to have equality, real equality, quantitative and qualitative equality in the world, we're not likely not to have power struggles, because this is going to be continued. Whether or not then it becomes a violent one, it should not be. Because in some of the African countries, but also in South Africa especially, we are finding that the more women struggle for equality and the more they achieve, the more the society, and especially within the family, you have violence, domestic violence, and it's not unrelated to the power struggles between men and women. And we think that in post-conflict, there should really be an attempt by those that come to help to really integrate the society and assist, in particular, the young people, because the ones that suffer most are the young people, as I've said. And I think that we need to develop minimum norms and standards for the rights of citizens, wherever we may be, and the rights of human beings. The fact that I'm a citizen of South Africa, I'm a human being, I belong to the universe, and therefore there should not be an issue about me when I go to another part of the universe. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've said that we as Africa, and also as South Africa in particular, are looking at our 2063 agenda, not that we're waiting until that time, to really try to address the question of power relations amongst people, and especially political and economic power. And we are hoping that we could have a world where there's no superiority or inferiority, and no double standards about human beings. Where, as I was saying earlier on, the principle of Ubuntu, Ubuntu, Ngabantu, should prevail. I am because you are, and you are because I am. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now, we would like to follow a session of questions and answers for you, if it is okay. So we would like to start questioning, please.
I want to get an opinion on two subjects that are kind of hard to discuss. One of them is the problem with, how you said, rape and things like that. I had a history teacher I really admired with some really independent and unique ideas. She told me that to be actually a human being in the sexual matters, you have to have an education. And real education would be to actually have a system that would help people who don't get to have a family to get to go to somewhere like let's say prostitution legalized. If we would do that, she said, we could take care of the women who are nowadays doing this job, and we would make a more real step towards preventing diseases and giving it's kind of hard, this stuff, like to explain, but to give them a decent place of work, because it is in the end a job that people are forced to take or decide by their own will. The second one would be, if you think this could
Sorry, I have to interrupt you. I would like to ask Her Excellency if she wants to ask more questions at once, or just one more. It's okay. One more,
the
please.
second one would be, I heard from more European opinions of others that they say in Africa, I know there is manipulation on the multimedia of giving a bad view of how Africa is as a state, and not saying the good parts as well, but they are saying there is already money, a lot of money invested in lots of projects, but there are not enough actually leaders or education enough movement to actually stabilize the problems that are there. They are saying that there is a lot of things doing, but the answer is not to give money to all these organizations. It's to these organizations that are trying to help and stabilize the situations to actually bring more solutions, if that is clear enough.
Yes, only that the question being,
because this last one was more likely common.
What would be an opinion to people who started to think that there's too much money going to Africa and not enough solution and action taken? So we should have better solution and then put money and give to products.
Let me start with the second one. Actually, I think that the presentation may not be exact. It's not that we're looking for money as Africa. It's not money we're looking for. We argue as Africans that Europe underdeveloped Africa. Our resources were taken, raw resources, and they continue to be taken. I've talked about raw material, like minerals. I've talked about the oil that gets taken. But I can also get on to agriculture, agricultural products, and many things. As South Africa, for instance, we're the second largest producer of gold. But if you look at who sells gold, where is the finished product of gold? It's not in South Africa. Botswana is one of the largest producers of diamonds, but the processing does not happen in Africa. All we are asking the world is give us an opportunity when invest in Africa, but don't invest in such a way you come in with your tools and everything, and you produce in our country, and you take everything out. So there's no investment that you make in Africa. The AU is asking for foreign direct investment, and we're saying when you get on to invest in our countries, in our continent, have partnerships, joint ventures. Don't come in as the multinationals that take everything and you are left with absolute nothing. Thirdly, we're saying that when you come in and invest in our country, leave skills. We are admitting that our skills are very limited. And even where we have skills, the tendency is to go outside because people think that they'll find better jobs elsewhere. So it is not physically coins, euros, that we want. We want a partnership that allows Africa to be able to develop itself and contribute as it does to the world. Because at the moment, it contributes in a very unequal way where resources are taken from our country. Raw material is taken from our country. So it's not, I think that's a mistake where there's money. We do have money. Of course, we do have programs and projects that will need money, direct investment of money. But that's not our primary thing when you talk about economic development. Secondly, the other thing that we then want to talk about, this question about, I saw you making an unfortunate relationship between rape and prostitution. Of course, in some instances, these are related, but most of the time, and in South Africa, and I cannot talk about a continent that has got 54 countries equally, we're not quite the same on these matters. But rape in South Africa and in most of the African countries is not because of prostitution. Secondly, well, this question is an old age question as to whether prostitution is a profession. I have two granddaughters, and I advise them on career development. And I don't think I would advise them as one of the careers that they should be prostitutes. So that already has got connotations. And we should be looking at the root cause that leads to prostitution. And legalizing may be an issue, but it is not a solution to prostitution. Because the root cause, it's not one young woman at 14 who decides, I really think that I like my body so much that I should sell it. I should sell a particular part of my body to the world, to men. I don't think it's like that. It's because of economic difficulties that some of them find themselves in. And we in Africa, and what we're saying is that the countries must look at really developing economically so that that option is not open at all. Of course, we cannot rule out people taking a decision as to what they plan to do with their bodies. But Africans have got a fundamental value system. And the question of sex in the African society, generally, sex is not seen as a commodity. It's seen as something else, but not a commodity to be sold in the market.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now, I would like to ask for 2 more questions. One there.
Your Excellency, considering the communal society that exists in most African tribes and has been part of most Africans' history in the past, would you think that a more socialistic approach to industry and economy would help Africans in the long run? Because most African tribes already have a communal system. You could say that Africans are more prepared than Europeans were for a socialistic approach.
You okay. The other one.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say a very big thank you for taking that time to be here today. I made a few observations about your speech, which I'm really grateful for as well. The first one is about the image of Africa. The first reservation I have as regards that is that there's so many other good things that people are doing as regards Africa. Africans are doing in Africa and outside Africa. But the problem with society and media is it's harder to see the good and it's easier to see the bad. So I think this is the problem that Africa First Up is dealing with. I can only from Nigeria I can mention 3 women that are doing great on the international scene. Obi Ezekwesili, Chimamanda DJ, and Okonjo-Iweala. These are women that are doing great for the country and for Africa as well. But then, as regards the evolvement or evolving of Africa, wouldn't you agree that it is something that Africans and its leaders should invest more in, rather than seeking partnerships from, for example, the European Union and the United Nations? And the reason I say this is just I think 2 days ago, we had a discussion about partnership where we found a fault in the definition itself, which tells us that it is one that can be established between 2 people of like minds with the same vision, that are willing to take the same risk and share the profits. Unfortunately, that's not the situation that we see with Africa and the outside world. What we see is a situation that we have a vulnerable Africa that wants to evolve, that has the resources to evolve, however, doesn't have the collaboration that it not less, I wouldn't say need from outside. Personally, I believe for Africa to develop or for Africa to evolve, it doesn't need the collaboration, necessarily need the collaboration of the outside world. Why? Because we have the intelligence, we have the resources, we have the people, the minds, to do the things that we need to do. However, we don't have the commitment. And I say this referring directly to the leaders of the countries in Africa. They don't have the commitment to influence their countries in such a way that the resources that they have can be used to better the lives of the people in those countries. So the question would be, is it the approach of internal sourcing or insourcing rather than outsourcing more convenient and productive for Africa? The final one would be as regards the effectiveness of the African Union. How can the African Union become more of a power in the international scene than it is right now? Because I feel it could be doing a lot more work in tackling the issues in Africa. For example, going to Nigeria, the northeast, Boko Haram. I feel that, and you also had the situation in Mali as well. Mali had to wait for France to intervene in its, in the crisis that erupted. Meanwhile, the African Union could have passed resolutions that would directly tackle those situations. Same thing for Boko Haram, and of course, what's happening in South Africa right now. So, how can the AU become more effective in tackling the issues of the African people? Because so far, it's not doing enough, I would say.
Excellency?
Of course, the questions come from the continent, so they're going to be very difficult because I think that you actually are putting some of the challenges that are facing us as Africa. I think the first thing that not the first thing, one of the things that we're doing as Africa is to look at intra, as you're saying in both questions, the first one and the second one. This question of Africans, the African leaders, the African youth, the African civil society, always looking as, oh, poor Africa, oh, poor us, Western world, other people help us, is something that At the conference of the youth in 2013, this was one of the things that the youth were saying, that let's first and foremost start in ourselves, within ourselves, and see how we can resolve some of the challenges. And I think that this Agenda 2063 is an approach at looking at that. And when we've done the 50 years learning from the OAU, then we're then saying step by step, what do we do in the first 5 years, in the first 10 years. The second thing is that if you look at some of the programs that have been put by the AU, including an emphasis on intra-trade within Africa. Intra-trade, why is it that South Africa will rush to go and invest or have partnerships, whether it's in China or in London, instead of going to Nigeria and look at partnerships, instead of going to Egypt or any of these countries? We've got countries in Africa, now these countries, some of them including Nigeria, South Africa, Angola, are being called, as against what was called previously, the tigers of Asia. Now we're talking about the lions of Africa. And you're talking about 10 economies. But these 10 economies, when you look at their own internal economies, they are still dependent on exports rather than on intra. So that is one of the things. We're talking about infrastructure development, that when you talk about the need to have intra-trade, you need to be talking about the infrastructure, including your roads and your rails and your whatever, so that you can move your goods. Not easy, it should not be easy to move your goods from Benin to France, rather than move your goods from Benin to South Africa or to Algeria. But at the moment, it's easier to move most of the goods from Africa to Europe and to America, rather than internally. So if we thought we can really work on ensuring that we develop internally, and there's already attempts, and these Africans are appreciating the questions of universities, that you have University of Cape Town putting a priority in terms of admission of students, external students, to putting a priority to scholarships and to African students. And that are also happening in Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and all the other countries, so that we take collective responsibility for educating our youth. But above all that, to really ask the young people themselves to then say, this is your continent. You are never going to be non-African. You're going to remain African. It doesn't matter where you go. You can marry, you can go and settle, but it doesn't matter in whatever country. You know, in South Africa, there are many European people who have settled in South Africa. They're not called Europeans. They're not called Americans. They're not called Italians. They're called South Africans. But if I go and settle in Italy, I'll still be an African. I can stay there for 30 years. I'll still be an African. So your identity you cannot discard at any particular time. And this question of being vulnerable, I think I agree with you that we tend ourselves to present ourselves as these vulnerable entities. And one of the key things is Africa has got to unite as the African continent, as the Africans proud enough, with a shared vision, with a shared program, with a shared understanding of the world. The partnership, we don't need to be partners as Africa. We're African, so we can have this shared vision. And I agree with you, the question of the effectiveness and the question of the lack of commitment from our leaders. It is true that we have some African leaders that are not committed to Africa, that are not committed to the African agenda. But it's something that those Africans that have got a vision and a view must work in their areas, wherever they are, for the promotion of Africa, in work, in word, and in deed. How effective we can be, it's very difficult to say we will not be effective, but we will be effective, in my view, if the Africans, as Africa, are committed to themselves. But of course, there's also the interesting world. I participated I was serving in Italy, and we had multilateral fora on food and agricultural fowl. And what was very sad for me as an African is that we would sit as what we call the Africa Group, and we were 52 countries. And one country would come to probably some of us. The previous colonizer would come to the previous colonies and talk to them and say, we think that you should, we, the colonizer, we think that you should do A, B, C, and D. And of course, remember the school that we're building wherever, remember the whatever. And because they've got the power of the purse, which we were talking about earlier on, the power, she or he who wills the wealth, then wills the power. And that is the unfortunate thing. But in general, I think I agree with you that it's something that intra-Africa we need to be working on.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now, I would like to pass the discussion to our next speaker so that we be respecting the time of the symposium discussion. I would now give the word to Her Excellency Shiva.
Your Excellency, I was impressed by your modesty and your presentation. You said that you are not academic, that you are afraid to face this bureaucratic. So you did a very good presentation. I will not touch upon the area you did in order to avoid overlapping. Let me say a few words about myself. I'm a diplomat, career diplomat, and let's see, represented OEC, you might know about this organization, in different conflicting areas like Balkans, Central Asia, and beyond. So I was involved directly in those areas. I was in contact with people trying to improve their situation according to my responsibilities. And I dare to say that I have an understanding and knowledge about the struggle and power in all those areas. But let's define, or at least restrain the area of our discussion. We are Romanians, we are from Europe. And I think that all of you agree that we'll also face this phenomenon, struggle of power, internally and not only. So I would say that not only in Africa there is struggle of power. Struggle of power is everywhere. It is different kind of, maybe more sophisticated, I would say, in our case. More visible or less violent. But lately we were, how to say, under this huge use of power in our vicinity, and I am talking about Ukraine. So I am waiting your questions in this regard, in this respect. What was it? What is it? What will be? But certainly there is a power struggle, geostrategic one, with a huge number of victims, and let's say, talking about human dimension, both aggressors and let's say victims are suffering, and not only. I would say that the whole continent is almost divided because of this conflict. So you see the consequences of this struggle. Also, to your analysis and consideration, may I remind you some because I don't want to enter into deep history, but recently, quite in these 25 years since we are a democratic country, you maybe remember disintegration of Yugoslavia, in Kosovo. Then let's remember also Iraq, financial crisis, economic crisis, energy crisis, access to water resources, climate change, made sometimes by human. So, and not only that, but disintegration of some countries. Let's take Soviet Union and the consequences of that. Then struggle for independence on ethnic reasons. So, and this creates a huge picture of consequences. Some human beings, some are suffering without being directly involved in it. Even some projects for modernization of some countries, like access to water resources, building a dam, or creating some ways for pipelines, and so on, and so on, are directly affecting human beings living in that area, preventing their access to water or damaging the environment. In 2002, I had the opportunity to translate the famous book of Sadata Ogata, Japanese famous representative, the book called Human Security. It was for the first time this issue was discussed deeply under the aegis of UN Secretary General, when this concept that security does not belong only to the state. Security is about human beings too, as Her Excellency mentioned. So let's pay attention to human security more than security of the state, because the state has capacity and should have capacity and means to defend itself. Human beings not always possess this capacity, because they are victims, innocent victims, living in the area where conflict is occurred, or some things are happened. Let's take this issue of populations expelled from certain areas, or living in certain areas which is occupied by different forces. In other words, power struggle is everywhere and is coming from from everywhere. Nobody is absolved. Let's move to the current days, to our area. You know, we are in Europe. We are member of European Union, of NATO. Are those two actors able to protect us fully? Other countries would like to be integrated too. Let's talk about Balkans. They are asked, or they are invited to make some efforts. On the other hand, certainly there's some problems related to their capacity or their readiness to accept all those rules, regulations, values. We're talking about values, democratic values, and always are looking toward Western democracies, US mainly. But what is going on in the US? US is losing its superpower, its ability of being superpower. In Europe, there is already some competition among some countries, powerful countries, whether we should go into one direction or another direction, but population is still waiting something which would improve their life. And this is the problem. The population's life is not progressing, is not improving. So we accept it, we are going, and not, I'm not talking only about Romania, about the all Europe. Let's take Greece, let's take Turkey, Balkans, and all other countries. We want to live in a peaceful, democratic, but prosperous area. And apparently, this target is somehow diminishing, and it's like a dream. Why? Again, all analyses are leading to the existing power struggle. Who want to influence what? It's not only internal struggle, it's also the main actors who want to control one area or another, or to have an influence over some areas. And I would not talk about too long. Let's shortly touch upon Central Asia, which is a very interesting area. I served there several years as a representative, head of mission for several years. So these countries obtained their independence without looking for it, without asking. And everybody, or all organizations, all powers were to provide assistance. So those countries were under Soviet rule for very long periods. And suddenly they were left alone for state building, nation building, even language building. You cannot just imagine that their national language didn't exist. It was in some memories, but not in use. And also situation was that disintegration happened without discussing borders, without analyzing situation. It was like Stalin engineering decided, let's put the border here or here. He was, let's say, smart enough to not to create compact groups of people. And we are facing now some conflicts. We are facing now some lack of education and also influence of from the South Islam. We are facing the struggle and competition among, let's put it, big actors. Western countries China, Turkey, Iran, but mainly Russia, because Russia cannot accept that former Soviet space would be not under its sphere of influence. So I would say still we have to be optimistic and look for conflict resolution in a peaceful way, because otherwise, even if the conflicts are taking place there or in Africa or somewhere else, we will be also suffering in our countries from economic point of view and not only. The world is interconnected and new challenges are huge one, and all analyses are looking how to solve those issues, because nobody expected that the challenge would be so big and so complex one. Those challenges do exist also on our continent, and you know them better than I could present them here. So in order to make shorten my presentation, I stand ready to answer your questions in different aspects. Thank you.
Nancy. Now, if there are any questions on the issue, let's begin.
I wanted to ask, given the fact that according to the World Press Human Index of 2014, Turkmenistan has been on the least, it is tied with North Korea on the liberty of press. Could you give us an insight on how a country like this, based on the power struggles inside a country, is how it is like inside such a country, because it is clearly different than North Korea in the sense that the people are happy in some sense, and I was curious how such a country exists inside.
To answer to your question, you said how is power struggle inside? There is, I would say, still authoritarian regime. So it's improving. It's constantly improving. Some political parties appear, but we cannot say that the country is democratic one. There are still limits to, let's say, basic democracy, like free travel, free speech, free media, those elementary things. And human rights are quite in very complex situation. But I would say situation in Turkmenistan is, let's say, better than Korea in North Korea. Turkmenistan is part or member of OECD. We have the center there. I was head of center in 2002, 2004. So assistance is provided by Western countries in fighting them. So they are making progress. It is a very rich country.
Citizens are happy in the
Yes,
most part.
and that's why this country presents a special interest for big power. It is on the Caspian Sea, and Caspian Sea is huge reservoir of, oil, but the status was not solved yet because of rivalities among countries.
And how do they enforce this lack of liberty? This press, the press being very oppressed.
How to say, they have outside the country some dissidents who left the country and are just contributing to the improving of the situation. I would say that since I left Turkmenistan till now, the situation has improved. However, we cannot say that it is at the level of, I don't know,
Most, yes.
it is at the level of other countries from Central Asia. And just echoing what Her Excellency said, we cannot impose our democracy. We have to understand them and to be passionate in preventing human rights abuses, eliminating them, but spreading democracy where it is possible and not by violence. They would not accept it because it is about respect for the nation. It is about respect for the state. But preventing human rights abuses, it's a must. And we are doing that. So through trainings, through, let's say, improving legislation, improving state institutions working, and so on and so forth. So this is our job. But it's still long.
Thank you, Excellency. Okay, 3 more questions. Okay, maybe more. Let's begin. This time begin with
Speaking about power struggle, what do you think is the major conflict nowadays that affects the map, the global politics? That one major conflict. Only committee right now, and I'm asking this question. In your opinion, I know that there are a lot of conflicts, but I'm curious, what is your vision about that one major conflict that affects the global politics?
You know, this is rather a complex question, as you said, and the answer will be also maybe diplomatic one. So it's not a secret that one country, let's say, one particular actor cannot accept democracy or values which are promoted, or role of those organizations which is, let's say, growing or entering into its area of influence. This is the main reason. And it was stated in the, let's say, not now, but since the coordinates of foreign policy was elaborated, that those countries, they could maintain relations with the European Union, with NATO. They could, let's say, accept economic assistance, but not association and integration, because it means that in their backyard will be presence of troops of NATO, so on and so forth. So this is it's, let's say, geopolitical struggle rather than struggle of powers. But this struggle is represented or affecting the great powers like NATO, US, and Russia, Germany, France. All of them are, let's say, in a way or another, involved in it trying to, some of them trying to peacefully, to find a peaceful solution. And the effects of it, you probably know that Russia is almost defeated because of internal consequences of this. I mean, the population, we are talking about human dimension. When you face sanctions and your population cannot buy usual products they used to, it cannot lead to peaceful life. They would wonder why. Why should we suffer because of? And other things also. At the same time, Ukrainian population is suffering, and neighboring countries are suffering, European countries are suffering, European businesses affected by all these huge conflicts.
Thank you, Your Excellency. So, any other questions? Let's start exactly at the way we please.
Thank you. Good day, Your Excellencies. Thank you for the eye-opening speeches. If permitted, I would like to pose an open question to both our speakers. They both touched on humanity and a humanitarian way of solving conflict, more orientated to normal human beings and to state actors. In your opinion, which is a good way to ensure such an orientation? Do you think international organizations, be they governmental or non-governmental, should be more involved in such an action? Thank you.
I wanted to say, and maybe, let's say, I apologize that I didn't mention that one of the powers is civil society, recent powers. Civil society role is growing, and civil society could do a lot, even better than state, than a particular state. And it is accepted in different areas. So I think using better civil society, internal, and those, without allowing them to enter into this power struggle, which is above, would be one of those ways. But also there are organizations specialized to provide assistance. And I mentioned the organization I represented and still represent, like OEC, has a huge mission there. I know that some are very skeptical, but OEC does not use, let's say, hard power. It's only soft power. Soft power means promoting democracy, trying to solve peacefully conflicts, and let's say training and so on. Hard power is provided by NATO and maybe some countries like that. But also for that, there are some documents already signed by those countries, and some of them already violated, and I am talking about Russia. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Excellency.
Well, I think from the South African perspective, we are the ardent believers in human beings in each particular country being able finally to resolve their own issues, including their conflict. And the resulting to international would be if the internal has failed. But even then, whether you have the international support, it should be in conjunction with the internal. And as Excellency has said, one of the key partners or groupings within a country would be, to what extent is civil society itself organized and ready and able to tackle some of the difficulties that each country can face. And again, coming back to my favorite question, is to what extent are young people, youth in all our countries in the world, organized so that whatever is happening, conflict or not, they can say, not for our future, because whatever is happening now is going to impact on what happens to their lives and their own children. So it's a question of not in our names, not in our future. I have found in some countries that the young people tend to be laid back about the future and leave to the elderly to do as they please, including even if they do the positive. So civil society has got a critical role to play. Organization, especially of young people and all the formations, women, religious bodies, for them to be able to tackle their own internal issues. And as Excellence was saying, that the dependence on the state. The state can do certain things, but sometimes the state is not even able to defend the democracy, the state itself. And therefore, the watchdogs for democracy will be the citizens, because it's not the democracy of the state and its institutions. It is the democracy of the citizens. So it's a role and responsibility of citizens. But if at all we then resort to international, there are international bodies. We as South Africans find it very difficult where we tend to be focusing on a particular country, or a particular country sees itself as the watchdog of all of us in our countries. Our view is that we've got to strengthen the United Nations and all international bodies so that whatever conflicts or whatever problems, challenges arise, they are taken to multilateral fora where countries are represented and where there is no superior or inferior, irrespective of their sizes. At the United Nations, now you've got the superior ones because they've got veto powers, and then you've got the junior ones because they don't even sit in the Security Council. So these are some of the issues. So you start with the internal, but the internal itself must be organized outside, not on government. Issue of government is quite critical for us in South Africa and indeed in Africa. Issue of good governance. But we've got to define ourselves good governance, so that what somebody defines also as good governance may not necessarily, I'll talk later about the question I was asked earlier on about communalism. But over and above the good governance, the government, the civil society must also be organized and must be an active citizenry. And this is why young people have got to be active citizenry. It's their future. And of course, then you resort to the international, but the international in terms of the recognized institutions, not individual countries who give themselves the responsibility.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Were some other questions?
I got the answers I wanted.
Okay. There were
I had two questions. One was directed to both ambassadors, and the second one was directed to the ambassador of South Africa. Well, for clarity's sake, I want to reiterate my belief in the already historically established pathway to achieving power, which is that of I don't know, the encouragement of the concepts such as self-belief, hard work, and I don't know, a hope for a stronger tomorrow. This, I believe, through history has proven itself to be how most of the world powers achieved the power that they have. Now, the question I have for both ambassadors is, wouldn't it be more efficient if the populace of these countries are educated in such a way whereby they have more access to these types of concepts, that of self-belief, of hard work, and the importance of it, you know, the results of these things? Wouldn't it be more effective to preach these things as a means to finding a balance to the inequilibrium that exists in the power struggles of the modern day? Now, my second question to the ambassador of South Africa is, as regards trade and labor and the unity of Africa, is it possible in the first place that Africa opens completely its borders to labor and trade, just like the European Union did? And if it's possible, how can we see such a future for Africa happen? I believe that strengthen the call for unity or the idea of unity of a united Africa. But then, is there any hope that that can happen? And if there is a hope that it can happen, how do we see that happening?
Okay, thank you. Now, I will invite Her Excellency. The first question was addressed to you as well as Her Excellency. The first question wasn't the
Yeah, the first question was, yeah, it was both.
So I apologize that I didn't mention education. Education is very important everywhere. I mean, what we are doing and what we have to encourage is to improve education as a process, but also education on what human rights are, what democracy means, how could you, let's say, obtain the better life and so on. Also, how to promote those means and to achieve your interest peacefully, like entering or not in the political parties, about what kind of sources and resources. Yeah, so this is very important, and I think that there are a lot of institutions, both in every country, but also international, governmental or non-governmental institutions who are promoting such kind of projects, sending experts, organizing trainings, inviting them to different discussions or debates, case studies. You know about case studies. Let's take a country and discuss about what is the situation in the field of freedom of media. So media is very important actor, but not all kind of media, not all kind of freedom. I mean, freedom is obvious, but professional level of media is also very important. Otherwise, media will be misused. I don't know whether you understand what the message I wanted to say. Also, that there is a need to send or to train and to identify those aspects which are penetrating countries even like ours, like trafficking of human beings, trafficking for narcotics. So, and to spread or to prepare the population to defend itself. It is called combating trafficking of any kind, and it is related to what I mentioned, human security. And in Romania we also are afraid of this, let's say, this phenomenon, which is more and more present, particularly affecting the young generation. And if they do not know how to defend themselves, like in sexual abuses, then they will be certain victims of it.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Please, I invite you to.
I just wanted to comment on what you're saying, Ambassador, on human security. Because we find sometimes that there's over focus on what we call the military security or those kinds. And yet, in our cases, in South Africa for instance, our worst threat is not intervention, is not a war from outside, is not occupation by some foreign forces. The human security is poverty in South Africa. We have got high levels of poverty, high levels of inequality, high levels of joblessness, and the worst affected again are the young people and female-headed households. So for us, the definition of security has had to be broadened rather than look at those kind of security only, but also, so I thought that I just wanted to agree with you that human security. And on this question of education, I would like to link the question of education to the question that was raised, and I'm sorry, I must apologize, I omitted your question. The African there was going for me, so I just had to, you know, Africans like going for each other. I'm sorry, I'm joking. But I think one of the things that you were raising is our history as Africa, as Africans, in terms of not only our economic system, but our lifestyle and worldview, where it is based on the spirit of commune. The commune, more than the individual, is primary. It's not me. So the I, me, myself, my cat and dog is something that's foreign to generally all Africans, from the north to the south. And the second element for Africans is the issue of solidarity and support. Is to the extent that we've got a common word in different languages that is called ilima litsima, which means that we come together and work on your field, and the produce is shared amongst us. So, and also the issue of consensus, that for us this question of voting for anything is something relatively new. We used to believe in consensus amongst ourselves in agreeing. And the spirit of the common good, that the individualism is un-African. We don't believe that I, me, myself. We believe in we. So even in some of our languages, the emphasis when I talk about C. I don't talk about D, which is D is I, and then C is we. So we are a we kind of people. So that kind of mentality, and when we're producing, we were producing because we depended on the world, on the land. We're producing on our land and we shared. And if at all we went to hunt and so on and come back, it is also shared. And if you don't have land, the land was also shared. So that spirit of communalism, I think, is a basis. I cannot say it's a basis for socialism because I'm not quite sure I know what socialism is with the kinds of socialisms that exist in the world. But we can talk about the communalism, because even the way of production with ourselves is something that is very new, question of individual. And the question of private property is something that comes very late in our lives. And the economic system, therefore, will be an economic system of communalism based on this spirit. And therefore, it is quite critical for us as Africans, when we talk about education, not just sort of generalize only the technical, but also the education, which is something that has not happened in most of our countries, where our own value systems and who we are, our identity, has not yet been fitted into the curriculum. And talking about South Africa, for instance, the history of South Africa is written by non-South African historians, and it's according to how they interpreted and saw us, even as they were colonizing us. And we've not been able, as South Africans, to tell our own history. And as a result, the examples that I use, for instance, in the primary school in South Africa, in history, they are told about the king and the queen. I love them to bits. But in terms of the priority for my grandchild, I don't see why she should be learning about the king and the queen and not learn about my own kings and queens in South Africa and indeed in the whole of Africa. So the education is quite important, but what also would be important in that kind of education is not an exclusively Afrocentric approach, but a lot of Africa in that education. Our values of respect, of the way we produce, and the way we share the resources. And the question of, we as Africans in general are not competitive people, that I'm competing with my neighbor. I believe in the common good. I share with my neighbor. And when the neighbor has distinguished himself or herself, I share in that glory. We share in each other's glories and achievements, and we share each other's sorrows. This is why in Africa in general, we don't have what we call, in general, but not, we don't have what we call a child who has got no parents. And parenting is not something, an orphan. And parenting is something that we say belongs to the community. A community makes the best children. But if at all you try alone to bring up a child, and this is becoming quite critical for us, as the so-called families have disintegrated because of migratory labor and other things. So the community should take responsibility for the children in that community. And I therefore agree with you that we've got a worldview and a kind of system, human system, that takes a collective. And I think that can easily be translated to an economic system that has got that collective view. But I will run short of defining it as socialism, you know. But I know that for Africa, capitalism, as is practiced in many of the capitalist countries, is not doing us good. It's doing good, but it's not doing Africa as a whole. So we need to bring, somebody says, a human face to capitalism, the way of production and sharing the resources and sharing the profits and so on. And education is quite important because my granddaughter is studying in a school where there are only 3 African South Africans. And all the teachers, including the teacher of Xhosa, my language, is from France, is teaching my child Xhosa. She cannot pronounce Kakekikuku as I do. So my grandchild comes and says Kakekikuku. Now, that's not my language. But because the teacher, and she tells me that I'm speaking wrongly, because when I say Ikirha, she cannot say Ikirha, I say Ikirha. Because the teacher cannot pronounce. So I'm just talking about the education itself sometimes getting contaminated to an extent of losing the value. But we need to strike the balance as we were talking. And on the question of movement and opening of borders, yes, that is what is in the agenda of the AU. And already we're talking about the regional bodies like ECOWAS, like IGAD, like SADC, like COMESA, all those are moving towards, we started with adoption of the freedom of trade, the FTA. But now the question of the borders, and one of the first steps that has been taken is that there's visa relaxation amongst Africans. And then secondly, you actually get what is sometimes a pleasure where it's already applied, where you get into a border, to the airport, and find a queue that says Africans, and you walk with pride. You're so discriminated. You many of this, so now you walk with pride, go to your gate, to your queue. Never mind that sometimes it's very long, but then of course you get the African recognition. And there is a question of relaxation of our borders and everything else so that we can have a freedom of movement of people and goods. And each region has started with that. In SADC, we're already doing it, the movement of people, relaxing those borders. But it's something that, in terms of the strategy, has been looked at. We should have completed that process, not later than 2030. Not later, so that is the ultimate, because as we're looking at this agenda, the movement of goods and people. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. One more question, if there are still any questions. Please.
You already said something about
Sorry, who the question is addressed?
sorry, for the ambassador from Africa. Sorry.
You.
About generosity. You said that in Africa everybody is generous and share everything with everyone. And my question is, do you think this is a cause for those who are taking your resources and not giving back anything? Do you think this is a problem, or do you think it will be in your advantage at some point?
Well, thank you very much. I think the issue of generosity, it is possible that it was abused because I'm at that age where I tell stories, because I'm old, so I tend to look backward. When people talk about colonialism, say that we were so generous that when the colonizers arrived, they gave us a mirror, and we'd never seen a mirror before. and we did not know the value, the difference between a mirror and land. And because they were giving us this instrument that allowed us to look at ourselves, we're so generous that we gave them our land, and they gave us the mirror. And generally in our houses we find big mirrors, we're still looking at ourselves. That's where the joke goes. So I think that that's the generosity, but I don't think that was the cause and the main thing that we got colonized. Even before colonizers came to our continent, they set in what was called in history the scramble for Africa. And amongst themselves they were sort of talking who's going to get what and which part. So that scramble was there. And when they then found in Africa these resources, Africans were quite ready, as you are saying, to share the things that were there. And of course, they were themselves bringing things that we did not have and which they had. So we were sharing everything. But I think it then goes into what then they did afterwards. And I think in terms of a value system, it's a value system that could be beneficial to the whole world. Generosity, not just generosity in terms of material, so that people should not be seeing us as looking for money, but the generosity of spirit. We Africans have got that generally. It doesn't matter where you go, the generosity of spirit as Africans. And Mandela, when he talks about Ubuntu, which is what I was talking about, the humanity and this generosity and this solidarity and support and love and respect, is that if you find a traveler on a horse and moving through your village and the person stops, even before the person asks where he has stopped, they give you water and they invite you into the house so that you can eat something, because already they are assuming that after this travel you need water and you need something to eat. And it's very new to us that when you arrive, one, you cannot get to a house and get food unless you were invited for a meal. It's un-African. With us, if you arrive, it assumes you're going to eat whatever it is that you're eating, not sharing. And the other thing that is new, just in terms of the culture, that you are going to be asked when you arrive at somebody's house, do you really would you like tea or whatever? We just offer, as Africans, we offer whatever we have. And of course, we didn't have a lot of things to pay attention to, Coke or Pepsi or this or that. We just offer what we would ordinarily have. So some of these values show our generosity. And I think that it's values that we should be impacting to the young people and to the children. This is why, as South Africa, we are committed to exporting, besides finished gold, to exporting the values of Ubuntu, because that is generosity.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Well, we've arrived at the ending of our discussions here today. I want to thank both Excellencies for coming here today and tell us about their experience, their knowledge, and discussing about issues that are pressing for everybody at the global level. Now, I have a certain announcement to make. The fact that after the break of 30 minutes we will have, we'll have to go in another room. You already know, I suppose, some of you. And if possible, with their permission, to make a photo